presence, and it's a great showing, so thank you very much. I want to say very quickly that, first of all, this is a very dear book to me personally. I care about it because I was around when I was being conceived and thought through. So I can say that I've actually learned more from seeing this book being made than from the book itself. Hopefully that will come. And today is one of those sessions where I'm sure this will happen. But yeah, I mean, I learn a lot from Maya. I continue to learn a lot from Maya and want people to learn from Maya. In fact, today I assigned like a different, maybe shorter, more reflective piece that Maya had written on about masculinity, victimhood, or I should rather say the impossibility of victimhood for Palestinian boys. And I gave it for a history of design lecture on political graphics. I'm saying that just to talk about Maya's work and how it beautifully cuts across disciplines. And I think today our panelists are a testimony of that. So yes, that's it from me. And please welcome Maya Mikdashi.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was Professor Ahmad Gharbieh. For those who didn't know, he didn't introduce himself. Associate Professor of Graphic Design in this department. I was being asked, like, how come we're hosting Maya Mikdashi? I think he gave a beautiful answer to why we're doing the book talk in this department. This department is actually quite proud to be very interdisciplinary. I also teach Maya's work and I use it in my own work. My name is Harb, for those who don't know. I'm a professor of urban studies and politics, and me and Ahmad are among the co-directors of the Urban Lab, which is hosting this talk today, as you see in the poster that he designed as well. I'm going to just say a few words on our panelists today, for those who are not familiar with them, and invite you to look at their bios in more detail on their website. And then we'll give the floor to Professor Mikdashi to make a short presentation, after which we'll have responses by our panelists and an open discussion. So we're going to be joined today by Elizabeth Saleh, Assistant Professor in Sociocultural Anthropology at AUB, who works at the intersection of political and economic anthropology. She's working on a book progress on young territory coming of age at the Beirut scrapyard. And those of you who don't know Elizabeth's work, Liz's work, would enjoy reading how she thinks about value in relation to young waste pickers in Beirut. You would see them very differently once you hear her speak about it or read about it, and especially how they're entangled in the multiple infrastructures of scrapyards and their economies of recycling and supply chains. We're also joined by Sara Mourad, a writer and an assistant professor of media studies at AUB, where she co-directs the Women and Gender Studies Initiative. Her scholarship and writings are on feminism, sexual politics, Arab media, and public culture, and you can read her in a number of academic journals and other media platforms. Currently, she's working on personal and political lineages of feminist thought, rethinking home as a site of struggle, loss, and belonging. Jamil Mouawad teaches politics at AUB as well. He's a senior fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative. Jamil has a PhD in politics from SOAS, and he's a founding member of the Beirut School for Critical Security Studies and the Ethics in Social Science Initiatives, both projects launched by the Arab Council for Social Sciences. You probably know him from Twitter, as he tweets a lot there. His research interests on state society span the subfields of comparative politics and political economy in the Middle East and beyond. Our speaker today is Professor Maya Mikdashi, who's associate professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. So she's going to speak to us about her first book, Sextarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon, published with Standford University Press in 2022. So this is a book that theorizes the relationship between sexual difference and political difference, the religious and the secular, law, bureaucracy, and biopower. Maya's work is grounded in ethnography and archival research and has been translated in multiple languages in Arabic, Turkish, French, Spanish, German, and Korean. I never knew that. She's published in multiple peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes and many public-facing venues. She is a co-founding editor of Jadaliya and is a member of several editorial boards. I will not mention everything she's done. It's all in the bio. Interestingly, she's also guilty of co-inspiring in documentary films about Baghdad and Iraq and the war filmed in Lebanon in 2006. And we're very happy to have her in this department with everyone else. I'm going to give her the floor and then we'll move to the table. تفضلي Maya.
Thank you so much for this invitation and warm welcome. It's very special for me to be here and to be introduced by Ahmad, who I've known since I was 17 years old and who we spent our college life basically together up and across the different campuses here. Also, I really want to thank everybody here who put this on and everyone for showing up. I know it's such a crazy time. It's also Ramadan, so I really appreciate people coming. And I really appreciate all my colleagues who are discussing the book. I am inspired by all of your work. I think we've all collaborated somehow in some ways, and I really look forward to having this conversation. We just decided today that I would do a short presentation, so it's going to be very short, and let's see how this goes. This is very high-tech, by the way, much more than anything we have at Rutgers. Okay. A child is born at a hospital. A woman goes to vote in parliamentary or municipal elections. A stupid and reckless decision about time sets off a sectarian panic about ways of life. A man is arrested by an undercover security agent he thought was hitting on him. A governor throws fuel to demographic anxiety about the birth rate of Syrians. A woman who wants to be cremated dies. A man whose mother is Lebanese has to consistently go to Amn al-Am for work permits. A migrant domestic worker cannot sue her abuser. A woman forced to prove that she is a virgin to her fiancé. A sectarian leader who is not registered as a member of the sect that he supposedly represents because he had, quote, only daughters, or because he wanted to marry a woman from a different religion, or because he wanted a divorce. How can we think all of these different examples together, all drawn from our location today? What is it that stitches all of this together? In this book, I suggest that sex is actually the seam that holds these state institutions together and stitches together all sorts of things like hymens and property, voting and marriage, murder and honor, sexuality and public space, violence and intimacy, corrupt judges and politicians, and citizenship, guardianship, and bank accounts. For those of you that haven't seen it, this is the cover of the book. It's a sketch by Huguette Calon, who, very interesting factoid, is actually the daughter of Bshara Khouri and was his diarist, kept all of his notes. So I just have a few things here to sort of set up our conversation, and I'm going to be brief because I would like to really get to the conversation. The world of the book that this book speaks to, it's an increasingly sectarian world with an increasingly sectarian understanding and feeling of political difference, globally, regionally, and within nation states. And here I'm using the word sectarian at multiple different scales. The word sectarian, exists in our context in a particular permutation but it also speaks to forms of difference that are increasingly felt and cultural and hard. So for example, there's a conversation about the United States today, that it's an increasingly sectarian political discourse. This sectarian understanding of political difference travels through often gender and sexuality. It is sextarian. So in fact, what I'm suggesting is that this increasing sectarian understanding of difference is increasingly sextarian. This is also a world we live in where more people experience displacement and mass migration due to war, climate change, or economic collapse, and everywhere they go, they inspire demographic anxiety. And demographic anxiety is another way to talk about the securitization of sexuality and of women's bodies. We're also living in a world of uprisings and counter-uprisings that unfold at the site of the body, and within, I forgot to do this, a political society that is continuously becoming more highly differentiated, and where political society is a collection of modular forms of legal status, of which citizenship is just one. So this book really kind of offers three concepts. The first is the title, Sextarianism. The second is evangelical secularism, and the third is the epidermal state. And it really kind of thinks through these different concepts across law and bureaucracy. So I did a lot of work بالعدلية here, specifically بالهيئة العامة لمحكمة التمييز, where I was just actually there last week. The archives of court decisions related to religious conversion and the experience of converts themselves, social movements, and activists that advocate for a culture of secularism and new laws and bureaucracy, and finally, the regulation of sex and sexuality through the state's courts and interrogation rooms. So the chapters really kind of, just to give a map of the book, okay, this is, to give a map of the book, there's a chapter on bureaucracy and government institutions, a chapter on the archives of Al-Adliya, the Cassation Court, a chapter on religious conversion, one on social movements, and finally about the experience of state violence via domestic violence, detention, hymen exams, and anal exams. So criminal and family law, how criminal and family law intersect. The book is anchored in three sets of literature and three fields, of which my discussants represent, the fields that I'm trying to be in conversation with. Those are, I think every book is kind of a collection of whatever the person is reading. So I read a lot of anthropology, I read a lot of political theory, and of gender and sexuality. Those are the kind of three fields that I'm in. So the book is doing legal studies, sexual and political difference, the religious and the secular, and the methods are archival and ethnographic and feminist. And I'm trying to also generate a conversation about the methods we use and the epistemological stakes of the methods that we use in our work. So a lot of times I get this, a lot of us know that Lebanon is really framed as kind of exceptional in the literature, both in the region, but more generally as a kind of odd political formation. So if the Middle East is framed as exceptional, Lebanon is framed as exceptional within the exception. Whereas I actually think Lebanon is an exemplary place to think about phenomena, global phenomena, including things like family law, displaced people, violence, empire, post-colonialism, and that is because really Lebanon is kind of represents an intensification point of something that is running through the nation state as a form, and that is the tying of political and sexual difference together. Well, I'm really excited to actually start our conversation. So as a concept, I will say this. Sextarianism draws out how sex and sexuality structure and inflect citizenship, secularism, and the state, and the concerns of social movements. It also suggests that producing, erupting, and securitizing the borders between the public and the private, and the supposedly public and the private, is really how kind of power builds itself kinetically, and how the state builds its power, kinetically speaking. While it emerges from research on Lebanon, it offers transnational frameworks for understanding, for example, bodily rights and sexual difference in different locations like the United States, Iran, India, France, or Lebanon, and it does so by focusing on technologies and ideologies of power that states share regardless of location: bureaucracy, law, and there's sort of two structuring binary mythologies: the religious and the secular on the one hand, and the private and the public in the other. The second concept here, which is the evangelical secularism, is a form of activism that aimed at a certain point to transcend a, quote, culture of sectarianism. I don't mean it in the Mikdashi way. And fostering, quote, a culture of secularism. And this is really about sort of pedagogical registers of activist movements and the sort of temporal motor of liberal politics. Now, central to this idea of evangelical secularism was the idea of a stronger state, a state that was sovereign over all aspects of citizens' lives and over the use of violence. But what do calls for a stronger state sound like from the position of people who experience state violence every day? And this is kind of the third conceptual tool that this book is offering, which is the epidermal state. This is a state that performs its sovereignty by materializing the stakes of bodies and sexualities through violence and securitization. The term epidermal state is meant to evoke the role of state power in regulating the body, and at the same time describe how the state materializes itself through its exercise of power. The epidermal state unfolds at the sites of sex, sexuality, race, and legal status, and instead of asking, what is the state, or where is this state, it asks, what is the state doing, and what does the state feel like every day? So I will end here. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Maya. The floor is open. We will start in the order shown in the image. So with Sara, Liz, and then Jamil.
Hello. Yes. Hi, everyone. So thank you first for Ahmad and Mona for organizing this and for inviting us to this discussion around Maya's book. I want to start by congratulating Maya and thanking her for writing this book and for undertaking research that is vital and necessary, and that I feel like few would want to actually spend so much time in all these archives and courts and the legal and bureaucratic archives of the state. And for making in the process of your research that architecture that we all inhabit less opaque, more accessible, and legible. So such scholarship has the effect of demystifying something about power for us, of showing us things like the banality of religion and religious conversion, like the sexism that permeates progressive politics, and the sometimes mundane, sometimes spectacular ways in which the fiction of sovereignty is performed into reality. So through ethnographic and archival research, Sextarianism, the book, maps out how state sovereignty is performed at the intersection of secular, religious, and sectarian laws. But it also traces how ordinary people navigate the legal architecture of Lebanese citizenship. In the process, it shows how sect and sex are in fact mutually constitutive categories, and how sexual difference and its codification into sectarian kinship laws, the personal status regime, is a main technology through which sectarianism is produced and reproduced. Sextarianism as a concept captures, I think, the book's major theoretical contribution to the study of the Lebanese state and citizenship. So here, in terms of how it's figuring or imagining or helping us imagine the Lebanese state, it figures the state as a sort of assemblage of secular, religious, and sectarian modalities of power, so pushing us to think beyond this idea of the Lebanese state as just sectarian. All of which mobilize, so all of these modalities of power mobilize sexual difference as a technology of stratification and governance. And in this regard, I think the book must be situated within a longer lineage of feminist and queer critiques of power in the Arab region and the Middle East more broadly. A critique that offers sex as an analytic to understand state power and sovereignty, and a critique that shows the limits of heterosexist and male-centered approaches to governmentality. So when I say to challenge heterosexist and male-centered approaches, I do not simply mean that we turn our attention to women and sexual minorities as historical and political subjects. It is not just that we need to diversify our research through an additive logic, add gender, add race, add sexuality, to make our accounts more inclusive or to retrieve experiences that have been overlooked by normative accounts of Lebanese history and politics. More than that, I think, to say that this is a feminist and queer intervention is because this intervention asks us to question the taken for granted categories of analysis through which we have come to understand ourselves as political subjects, but also the categories we use to order the messiness of the social world. Sextarianism, the book, asks us to reconsider what sect is and how it is actually constituted. But it also asks us to consider sexual difference as a constitutive feature of political difference, as a constitutive feature of Lebanon's political system. So sex is not incidental to politics, it is political. So here I'm glad you didn't go maybe into too much details because I wanted to talk about your conceptual contributions. So this is how I would summarize the book's main argument, or the structuring argument. Sectarianism is produced through the secular management of religious pluralism. Religious pluralism is predicated on the sovereignty of religious courts over the private affairs of citizens. This is the regulation of marriage, inheritance, divorce, and custody. So by relegating the regulation of kinship to sects, the state produces sectarianism, and with it the idea, which is also the myth, that sects are primordial social and political communities that pre-exist the state. Sectarianism, then, is produced and sustained through personal status laws. Laws that de facto engender inequalities between men and women, but also inequalities and differences among women. There is then nothing private about personal status, and personal status laws are not incidental to the practice of Lebanese citizenship and the structure of the sectarian order. It is its very sextarian foundation. And here I want to say that these critical contributions to our understanding of the state are not happening in a political vacuum. Sextarianism is what feminists have been up against for decades, what they have long known before everyone else. In addition to formulating anti-patriarchal politics, feminist movements and mobilizations and campaigns in Lebanon have also been spaces for the elaboration of cross-sectarian and anti-sectarian forms of organization. Women's efforts to reform discriminatory laws have always faced religious and sectarian backlash, precisely because their demands for justice or equality around issues like custody or domestic violence or sexual violence have been framed by the religious establishments as attacks on the personal status regime, a regime that sustains their very existence, their raison d'être. So when read within the framework of sextarianism, feminist struggles which took the law as their terrain, are not struggles for an abstracted notion of gender justice. They pose a real and radical challenge to the sectarian architecture of Lebanese citizenship. So whether through cross-sectarian or intra-sectarian mobilizations, and I'll mention two examples, women have faced the patriarchal backlash of religious establishments, which the establishment always frames in sectarian and religious terms. So examples of cross-sectarian mobilization is the women's campaigns around the criminalization of domestic violence and the passing of a draft law to protect women from family violence. At the time, so in 2011, there was a parliamentary subcommittee that was discussing the draft law, and Dar al-Fatwa, the country's highest Sunni authority, issued a strongly worded statement condemning the law. And this is how they condemn it. Islam is very aware of and concerned with resolving problems of poor treatment of women, but this should not happen by cloning Western laws that encourage the breakdown of the family and do not suit our society. So in addition, so this also threat to their sectarian rule is also construed as a Western conspiracy. Another example of intra-sectarian mobilization, and by this I mean the example of the Shia mothers' campaigns, grassroots movements for the custody rights of their children. So intra-sectarian because these women organized within their sect. They were not calling for a unified civil personal status law, but rather to reform the existing Ja'fari custody laws. So here in this intra-sectarian form of struggle, again, Shiite religious figures accuse them of tarnishing the reputation of their religious community and causing the disintegration of society, and claimed, and I'm quoting here, that the law would have a negative impact on Muslim children who will see their mother threatening their father with prison in defiance of patriarchal authority, which will in turn undermine the moral authority of fathers. So if I'm bringing these examples, and there's plenty more, it is to show how Sextarianism is made manifest not just in laws, but also in public discourse, to demonstrate its usefulness to understand contemporary feminist struggles, and to show how sectarian and patriarchal discourses are mutually constituted, and how they justify gender inequality and women's subordination in religious and sectarian terms. And here maybe one question I wanted to ask, or to put on the table here is, given all this, I kept waiting for maybe some form of endorsement of a unified civil personal status law in the book. I kept waiting for it, and I want to know, and I want to hear more about this. The idea that actually today, maybe the most radical political act that we can, or political cause that we can be behind is the passing of a unified civil personal status law as a sort of blow to the structure itself, as a sort of form of radical politics, really. So the second, so this is in terms of Sextarianism, and I tried to present the way I'm reading it. And the second major conceptual contribution, I think, is the idea of the epidermal state, as you mentioned, Maya. Here, the book engages the body as a critical site. So we have sex as an analytic. Here we have the body as a critical site upon which the state performs a kind of sovereignty and violence that Maya describes as epidermal, a term that is meant to capture the corporeality and materiality of power as it is exercised on the bodies of vulnerable citizens and non-citizens. By not limiting her study of state power to Lebanese citizens, Maya cautions against calls for a stronger state, noting the effects of a strong state on marginalized communities whose bodies the state already heavily polices and legitimately and routinely violates. Migrant workers, refugees, sex workers, people who have and enjoy having unnatural sex, drug users, the incarcerated. So this conceptualization of state power as epidermal allows us to see sex and sexuality not just as technologies of sectarianization, but also as technologies of securitization, of state control and repression. And here, the book looks at hymen and anal examinations to illustrate the embodied practices of state power. Noting how gender and sexuality, but also race, class, and legal status are intersecting biopolitical modalities of discipline and control. So sovereignty in this view becomes the capacity to inflict violence on raced, classed, and sexed bodies. Bodies whose very precarity and violability are produced through sextarianism. So as sort of the material manifestations of this sextarian regime. So it is not a coincidence that non-citizens are usually the most vulnerable to these sorts of exams. And here I think the contribution to add to sectarianism is that sex is not just an important analytic to understand sectarianism, so thinking through the logic of sectarianism. Sex is also central to the production of racial regimes that discriminate between white and non-white, between citizen and non-citizen. So sex in both places, applying it as an analytic, telling us something about how state power functions on citizens and non-citizens through sectarian and racialized forms of governance. And maybe I will end here with the evangelical secularism, and here's where I also wanted to ask you a question. So evangelical secularism, for evangelical secularists, whose activism you trace between 2009 and 2011, is used as an example of activist practices, as opposed to state performance of secularism, activist discourses on secularism. And the motive of these activists was to shape, you say, a counterpublic that would disrupt what they saw as a hegemonic sectarian space. And you talked about this already, so I'm not gonna repeat it. But my question is, to what extent can we limit our view and reading of secular, what you are calling as secular activism or secular politics, to this mode or strand of evangelical or dawah secularism? What do other forms of secular activism look like? And here maybe to push us to think about places that are not necessarily coded, or forms of politics that are not necessarily coded as secular, but where there is an anti-sectarian drive that is motivating them. And here I will return to feminist activism, to queer activism, as places that didn't necessarily preach the secular and didn't necessarily reproduce a civilizational discourse of moral superiority, but for whom displacing sect as the master signifier of difference was a primary objective, and I think also a politically productive one. So I will end here, and I will give it over to Liz.
Thank you. So anyway, it's a great honor and pleasure to have this opportunity to think. Shall I start, or yeah? Okay, so to have this opportunity to think and discuss Maya Mikdashi's work with Maya and my other esteemed colleagues, Mona, Sara, Jamil, and Ahmad. So thank you for inviting me to do so. And I just want to start by saying that one thing I've always admired about Maya is her clarity in writing. She writes in a style that offers not just lucidity, but makes the argument she's proposing as something that is so apparent that it almost seems to be silly that we've never even spotted it there before. So sectarianism, sovereignty, and secularism and the state is no exception. And the book begins with Samira and Jean, whose lives we learn through the archival documents that Maya studied amongst the files of Adliya and the Plenary Assembly archives. We learn how Samira tried to manipulate the sectarian system when, during the census of 1932, she claimed the single status as an attempt to escape an unhappy marriage. Later, her son Jean, whose bureaucratic status oscillated between illegitimate to one of having a mother and father, tried to resolve this issue once and for all, and he did so in an attempt to lay claim to inheritance, of which his cousins were trying to claim as rightfully theirs. Jean eventually lost several battles. For those in Lebanon, and who are confronted almost daily with numerous personal status laws and the bureaucratic maze, which makes even replacing one's hawiyya or ID a potential nightmare, the story will probably sound familiar. It might not be the exact same story, perhaps, but there is a sense of how one must constantly grapple with a system that is incoherent in that our identities, that is our bureaucratic status, are subject to change. They don't always match how we live our lives, and they're subject to change according to which bureaucratic institution we might be engaging with. So, Mukhtar is misspelling a surname, for example, personal anecdote, or even writing down the wrong surname could have huge consequences for generations to come. And thus, despite this incoherency, our bureaucratic system is still able to restrict and pin us down, our bodies, our sexes, our sexualities, our genders, our desires, and to pin it down in very, very violent ways. And this then, if you like, is a biopolitical at stake in Lebanon's state. It is a political violence. So in many respects, the lives of Samira and Jean is one such example, and their story resonates throughout the book. It is through them that we learn about what perhaps we already implicitly know, but which Maya spells out with great lucidity, that the dilemmas they faced in their lives, the decisions they took in terms of dealing with that bureaucracy, and the laws buttressing this bureaucracy must be understood and read as part of a colonial, I'm quoting here, colonial mode of social contract theory. This social contract is sexed, and sex rather than gender is key here for the issue at hand, for a body is defined upon its sex. This may well be channeled through religious institutions, but as the case of Samira and Jean tell us, it is underpinned by a notion of secularism that relies on sectarianism, which is one of separating religious from state sovereignty so that state sovereignty ultimately can operate secularly through religious institutions. I got it. So, so I quote Maya again here when she says, in Lebanon, the sexual contract with the social contract was consecrated through the personal status law. Now, crucially, Maya does not reduce sextarianism merely to an outcome of French and European colonial adventure. This is adventure, not adventure. So anyway, this story is far more complex. And once again, Maya makes it clear to us that in order to understand its insidiousness, we must understand the multiple ways through which the state, as a discourse, but through the hands of all sorts of different actors, continue to pin us down. Sextarianism shapes politics even supposedly outside of the remit of the state, including that of evangelical secularism. It can be informed by different imaginaries of the state, therefore, and perhaps most troubling for me to read, or difficult, was that of the epidermal state, where we see very literal terms of the genitalia of anus and hymen. So it is sex as a body and as a practice. So what kinds of sex that the body can be and can do, and what kinds of sex it cannot and cannot do according to this bureaucratic status, even if it might be doing otherwise. So broadly speaking, the book has pushed me to think not just about Lebanon, but conceptually speaking to discussions pertaining to sex and gender, sex and sovereignty, secularism and religion in new ways. And there are two other aspects, these are going to be my two kind of interventions today. And I'll be giving these two interventions, brief ones, in the hope of generating discussion. But it was great to emphasize on the second intervention, although the second intervention is not particularly long, but that's hope that we'll have a discussion from it. So anyway, I'll get to it. So, and by the way, the second one is much more explicitly related to political anthropology, of which I think there was some mention I was expected to discuss. So, so without further ado, the first one. And this one, to me, is also very interesting, and it comes from anthropology. Both of them do, but this one is a methodological thought. And this is related to the archive, where Maya spends, I wouldn't say spends because she's still there, spends a lot of her time. And just to quickly say that some of the most especially fascinating aspects of the book is when Maya reflects on the archive. Places like Adliye, the courthouse, come to life through the stories of, through the archive, through the stories of people who actually work there, including Yusuf, Mona, and Evelyn, and where they eat, how they reflect on their work. So Mona and Evelyn, talking about themselves as soukline workers, for instance, sheds important light upon how the likes of Mona, if you like, an archivist, view their essential labor. And I call this essential labor or work because it ultimately buttresses Sextarianism. Okay, so for alongside managing, ordering, filing, and so forth, it is people like Mona whose memory might be drawn upon when deciding upon a court dispute over inheritance, a right to a certain property, and so on. Because as we learn in the book, as you progress through the book, that memory of these archives, of these archivists, can become an archive when there are things like fires and limited attention given to maintaining the archives. And again, I think this is also very interesting in terms of thinking about this insidiousness of this incoherent bureaucracy that we're dealing with. So such anecdotes that Maya shares with us alongside the narratives that come out of the files themselves that she's closely read is for me an important strength of the book. The archive is not just situated outside of the state as a dusty, out-of-way place removed from the way in which the state works. It is mundane and ordinary, but we see there, it's there where we start to see the various techniques and technologies come to life. And that the archive is a living and breathing place, and not just in some magical, mystical sense, but because of how it is used to facilitate and reproduce sectarianism. So for me, Maya is really able to convey the archive as, and I quote here, an assemblage of people, paper, processes, temporalities, desires, economies, memories, arguments, and effects, all open to the reversal of time. And she's able to convey this by understanding the archive, methodologically speaking, as something that moves and change, but remains nevertheless very much intrinsic to the context at hand. And I think for me, this is actually a very important kind of methodological contribution to anthropology, at least, where the archive has historically either been integrated into fieldwork to supplement or complement ethnographic research, or it becomes a site of fieldwork itself. So this kind of shifting of how we think about archive in anthropology as a methodological tool or practice, if you like, is very interesting to me. And because you're doing neither. You're neither integrating or just making that the point of fieldwork. And the chapters are a testimony to that, moving from personal stories of your parent to encountering the state, personal status laws, and so on. But the archives and the stories that come from the archive and the people who are there, and even their memory, which becomes an archive, are intrinsic to these stories. So we start to see this assemblage as the chapters unfold. So that's the first intervention. It's the longer one, but I'm going to put greater emphasis on the second one. So the second one is to me what kinds of discussions I think your book generates as it's taken out into the world of political anthropology. And there are many different routes it could take, but I think one important discussion, if you like, for me, is pertaining to the issue of bureaucracy. And part of what interests me about your book is the kinds of violence that sectarianism generates. Alongside gendered and political violence, there is bureaucratic violence. Now, bureaucracy, as Muallim Weber told us many years ago, is the upkeep and maintenance of certain kinds of rational rules. It is what drives modernity. It is a kind of disenchantment. It drives modernity, including that of the state and the state's monopoly over violence and so forth. And bureaucratic violence, however, is not something we often think about when we consider the kinds of violence that the state monopolizes. And I suppose we don't, because in the state is supposedly legitimizing violence, so therefore we don't think about it. Anyway, these are all kind of big, rough brushstrokes. But I was wondering, to call it bureaucratic violence, what happens then? As a form of violence, then, is to think about the insidiousness of the state apparatus if we start thinking about it more explicitly in terms of bureaucratic violence. And to do that, to do so in the biopolitical sense, as what your kind of work is doing. Now, with the biopolitical in mind, or putting it aside but don't forgetting it, part of what some of the anthropological discussion pertaining to bureaucracy these days, part of what the discussion has to do with imagination, or rather the lack of imagination that bureaucracy entails. We're reduced to certain statuses, certain ticks next to boxes, alive or dead, married or unmarried, virgin, non-virgin, citizen, non-citizen, and so on and so forth. And yet, alongside these boxes, there are human stories of people trying to grapple changing bureaucratic systems and living their lives otherwise. So escaping a loveless marriage, to convert just for the sake of practicalities, even when there is a marriage full of love, regardless of one's faith. Along the way, there are bureaucrats, some with little empathy, and others with a lot more, who try to facilitate the sentiments and desires of people who are at the mercy of the bureaucratic form underpinning the Lebanese state. So just to conclude, and I suppose I wonder from you, Maya, is that if we think of sextarianism as a form of bureaucratic violence, where there is a reliance on a very utopic set of rules to govern our sex, can we think of alternative forms of bureaucracy that do not restrict or even kill our ability to exist? Or is it about time that we start doing away with bureaucracy altogether? Thanks.
Okay, I'll try. First, Mabruk Maya for this book. We all know how daunting and challenging it is to produce a book, so Mabruk. Personally, I find this book very compelling in a sense that it's not only the way I read it, of course, a book that conceptualized Sextarianism, but also a book that through it you can read about the recent history in Lebanon, so it's nice. And you can also read, it's almost a mini biography of Maya, her parents, herself, her upbringing, so this is also, interesting. I'm not going to repeat what Sara and Liz just said in relation to what's the argument of the book. By now you should know what Sextarianism is. And that the nation state, as Maya argues, is the result of the scaffolding between sectarian difference and sexual difference. First, I should maybe highlight that I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not someone who works on gender. I'm not someone who has legal knowledge, and I believe the book requires at least awareness of not only what the law is, but also, and this is something I would like to discuss with you, but also some legal texts and jargon. So I'm discussing the book as a political scientist, but also as someone who lives in Lebanon, who's a citizen or not, quote unquote, of this state. And I would like to discuss the book from a methodological perspective, which basically I'm going to ask a lot of questions. But also I'm going to inquire a bit about the political implications of this project, especially in relation to activism. And you have one chapter on basically activism and what you call the evangelic secularism. So again, I'm going to ask questions because I'd like to have a conversation about the book. But there is one chapter on archives. And Liz summarized it clearly, but I would like to go more to a more pragmatic and practical level instead of just conceptualizing the archive. And I would be happy if you can take us there and see what really happens other than the encounter with Muna. But I feel that the way I was reading about the archive, it's always the archivist herself, Muna, was handing you the document, or the documents came to you at some point or something like this along these lines. So I was wondering to what extent Muna was a gatekeeper for this archive. I understand that you went to look for cases related to sectarian conversion, and you ended up with a case related to Samir Jaja. So to what extent Muna was acting as a gatekeeper, preserving part of the archive, or also manipulating you as a researcher maybe because you want to, she wants you clearly to work on this specific topic. You might have completely changed the topic and work on Samir Jaja himself. So to what extent in this structure the researcher has agency facing this bureaucracy? So I didn't see you, for instance, asking for 100 case, sampling these, choosing 10 for a very specific reason. I only saw you as someone who's rather, engaging, getting to know Mona and Yusuf, the judge, producing this us from your perspective or her perspective. But I would like to see, and this is my second point, the methodology when it comes to the cases that you choose in this book. Why these cases? Is it just, a random selection of cases? Is it the effect of Mona and others on you? Or is it a process of sampling? Therefore, you chose, let's say, these cases because either they are the most representative of your concept, or they are the most common cases in this very specific instance. So I would have loved to know more about the methodology, like the 101 of this methodology and this journey. The reason I'm saying this is because I understand that Yusuf, the judge, and Mona were so happy that someone who's social scientist, anthropologist, interested in the law. And the law in this very specific instance is not rigid. It's subject to interpretation. There's you who interpret the law. There's the judge who interpret the law. There's the archivist who interpret the law. And most importantly, there is the context that imposes a specific interpretation of the law. This reminds me, for instance, of the work of Raja Abi Lama, who took the concept of إثارة النعارات الطائفية, I don't know how you translate it in English, instigating sectarian violence, and he argues throughout comparing different cases in the 70s, during the Civil War and in post-war Lebanon, that the judge doesn't interpret this same sentence in the same way. It has different meanings in different contexts. So where are your cases from this context as well? Are all rulings the same across the time, or they have changed throughout the time? Are the same before the war, during the war, or after the war? My third point as well is perhaps related to the political implication of this project. Reading the book, again as a Lebanese citizen, not as a scholar, I had the impression that the system, sectarian, legal, bureaucratic system, is totally encompassing. It's very rational. It acts upon us, violent or not, bureaucratically or not, legally or not, without us having the ability to resist it. And this is the importance of looking at the law not only as a rigid text, but also looking at how the law is interpreted and implemented. So I understand that you chose to work on anti-sectarian struggle when it comes to the laïc pride, but I would have loved to see something related to the anti-sextarian struggle. Because believe it or not, there are some cases where judges at different levels have taken decision to counter this understanding of sextarianism. Some rulings in relation to homosexuality, whereby a recent case in 2018, a judge at the primary level, I don't know, have issued something, that homosexuality is not, unlawful and is not against nature. That's one. Two, in 2016, lawyer Yumna Makhlouf and others have worked on sex change. And there is an instance where the article is in Arabic, but basically there is a ruling that acknowledges the right to change the legal category, quote unquote, of sex in Lebanon. So these are ways of us citizens being able, through the law, through the court, to challenge this sectarian system. And I would have loved to know more about this, because I don't, again, as a citizen, want to believe that this is a totally encompassing, rational system that we cannot change through the law, through the tools that the system offers to us, the law in particular. And this takes me to my final question, I was a bit shocked that you chose the Laik Pride as a form of, or what you call the heyday of anti-sectarian struggle, because in the same chapter you show that contradiction without this movement when it comes to what they want. Some wanted at the end to abolish sectarianism, others didn't want to abolish sectarianism. So why do you consider it as the heyday of evangelic sectarianism, especially that there are a lot of lawyers, institutions, social movements who have struggled a lot and are still struggling in order to produce this anti-sectarian struggle? Thank you. May I add one point here? and the reason why I'm saying, you know, I would love to see this holistically, in a sense that I would love to see also the conversation between the judge, the social movement, and the text. Because the way, you know, the judge used to judge in the 70s, it was maybe, and perhaps some of the literature is there, used to have a conversation directly or indirectly with social movements. Is it the same case now? Do judges really think about these social movements, or we've come to a point where everything is chaotic, and that's why there is opportunity for change?
Well, this is going to be a great. Thank you so much. These are really great questions and very generous engagement. I'm going to actually move backwards, just to switch it up. Okay, so, and start at the end, actually. The way that, I don't consider things like, and there's no changing of sex in Lebanese law, there's correcting of sex. You're not allowed to change it, you're allowed to correct it. This is based on the French Civil Registry. And it's funny because I'm actually working on a case now from the early 90s and 80s about a woman trying to correct her sex. And the reason why ultimately she's not allowed to, and people have always had this right in Lebanon, the earliest cases are back in the 70s. The reason why she's not allowed to is because she had children and she had been married. So even if she was allowed to correct her sex, the implication would be, oh no, now you have two women who have children. Oh no, what are we going to do? How are we going to register these children to a woman? Right? Because she had already been a father. So how can she then become, what will happen to the children? What are the rights of the law? And I want to start with this actually because the logic of the decision, which is actually against Lebanese jurisprudence at the time, because the decision was no, you can't do this, relied on French law, French Cassation Court decisions. And the French Cassation Court only changed this rule about two women being registered as parents in 2022. So what I mean by these forms of, I think the sort of trick of the law and of bureaucracy more generally is that you might want to make one change, but it sinks you back into this bureaucratic, hyper-regulated system that is based on sex differentiation. And the reason why I've always found this fascinating is because we basically have a French system of registration. And the French system is like so famously obsessed with sex across the world and in France. There's a reason why Foucault is French, right? And he came up with a theory of biopolitics because he was looking at the French civil registration system. So that's sort of one. I think, I can see, I also would love to have a way out. I think the trick of bureaucracy sometimes is that it sinks you back in. So it's not only about sex, it's about how sex is deployed across these multiple matrices: family, citizenship, guardianship, all of these things. So you might be able to change one, but even if you're able to correct your sex, all you're doing is putting yourself in a different position within this matrix that is grounded in the bureaucracy of sex. For those of you who are not legal, I mean, I didn't know anything about Lebanese law, I have to say, when I started my research. That was not, I had to learn a lot. But we don't have a jurisprudential system, for those of you that are Lebanese. We have a code-based system, and a code-based system also, this is French law, but where interpretation does matter, but it has to be continuous interpretation of the code itself, right? And it can move across different first court, high court, cassation court, court of appeals. So there is interpretation, and judges can use basically jurisprudence that comes up from the highest court, but it never becomes law. So it never actually changes the law. Jurisprudence does not change law. It's just, and the law actually about the interpretation about homosexuality, where the judge, and I think it was second court, but there were 3 different decisions, and these decisions are discussed in the last chapter of the book. The interpretation was, no, you cannot prosecute homosexuality or queer sex, not even homosexuality, just queer sex, because homosex is not unnatural. That's the new interpretation given, okay? What does that do, though, for other forms of sex that are still, quote unquote, unnatural? Why is the state at all telling us what is natural and what is not natural sex? So, for example, if this will become an authoritative interpretation, and even in one of those decisions, they brought up the and I think this is also in the chapter about loud sex, right? So they said, oh, this is not, queerness is not unnatural as long as you don't see it or hear it, right? So the investment remains the same, the regulation of sex and sexuality. And I think that was kind of how I approach at least this question of law, sex, and outside. I think if there is an outside, it's a totally different civil registration system. This is actually, to me, kind of the crux of the political question, is that you have to completely overhaul nufus and how it's run. And that project is not a Lebanese project. It's a much larger project of trying to divorce political from sexual difference, which is a global question. And it's the heart of sort of organizing political society through metaphors and practices of reproduction, whether it's social reproduction, biological reproduction, all forms of reproduction. I think the second, so no, the law is not rigid, but in many ways, and actually there's a very famous case, and I don't want to get into too much in the weeds, but there's a very famous case of a judge who did listen to social movements, I think it's in chapter 4, about actually a judge granting people the right to remove their sect, okay, from state registries, which created a whole nother bureaucratic problem. But then that same judge got raised, basically. Like he moved up in the institution, and then he issued a year later a completely opposite opinion that said, no, this is not allowed, right? So interpretation cuts both ways. They are also influenced by social movements and influenced by all kinds of discourse, including political discourse on what. And then here, I'm going to try to move both with Jamil and Liz on the archive. So I went to the archive to do something different. I thought I was going to study religious conversion. That's what I wanted, what I was very interested in as a graduate student. However, when I started seeing cases of religious conversion, I saw that what was actually happening were people were intentionally converting to make use of different sexual rights, different gendered rights. So sectarianism, secularism, everything that I had been thinking about wasn't sufficient for me to actually understand what was happening here. And basically, I did this practice, which I recommend as a sort of research practice, and I consider this a feminist method of research, is that I would go into this archive, and I said, you know, you've been working here for 30 years. You know more than I will ever know about the state. So why don't you tell me what you think is interesting? Why don't you show me something that you think reflects something critical about how law functions and how the state functions? And then they started sharing files with me, one of which was this 100-year file, which had evidence from the Ottoman and French empires all the way up to 2008. So the evidence, I think, started in 1896 and ended in 2008. And that became sort of the intro of the book. But I also learned through that our archive, our high court archive, the highest court archive, was burned during the war, and it was never recovered. Never fully, not only not recovered, but much of jurisprudence at this highest court was gone and could not be reconstituted but for things like, give me your copy of the court case and let me try to remember the handwriting of my colleague to make sure that this is a real decision, right? So that's how kind of the archive and memory function together to create a living, or at least a different form of fabric of knowledge production in which I don't think the researcher is sovereign. I don't think the researcher should be sovereign. We're never sovereign over what we do. And we're not sovereign over who we are. So there's another methodological point here about positionality, which is to say you're not sovereign over your positionality. I might look in the mirror and say, this is who I am. This is what is important to me. But once I enter a social space, that doesn't matter. What matters is how we are all positioned together and how that creates a certain space together. Do I think Mona was a gatekeeper? Absolutely. I think we're all gatekeepers. I think that's part of what knowledge production is to produce gatekeeping around knowledge. And I selected the cases of the book out of 120 cases that I have at home. And you have to choose. But on the plus side, that means you can have a whole career on what you didn't choose. You can keep writing about what you didn't choose. And what I found also fascinating about this question of interpretation is actually what doesn't recirculate into public discourse. So in the case of Jean and Samira, what actually happened is that you have the High Court of Lebanon saying, you know what, this census of 1932, you can't rely on it. People would have lied, they did weird stuff, nobody could have known they were lying. It cannot count as authoritative evidence in this court case, okay? So here you have the highest court in the land, which is now obviously not meeting because of the explosion, the Beirut port explosion investigation and everything that's happened around this court. It's the same court, saying, you know what, this 1932 census, that the state was infleshed around, you can't really trust its veracity, okay? So that perspective does not recirculate into public space. That interpretation doesn't recirculate. And this was something I really did want to circulate. That here you have the highest court in the land being like, 1932 census, she lied. And it's fine, you know, she wanted to get a divorce. Okay, again, I'm trying to move back here. When it comes to the question of biopolitics and bureaucracy, yeah, I wish we could have a politics that wasn't bureaucratic. It would be great. But I think that question is about how you organize social difference. And it's really also a question that gets at the heart of the form of the nation state as a form of political difference. So to imagine a non-bureaucratic political society is to imagine a radically open non-defined and non-reproduced political society. So it's actually about an ephemeral moment of coming together and not having to have this sort of social reproduction around society, around political society. When it's, let's see. I wish we had a unified personal status. I mean, I didn't say that, but I have written it elsewhere. And also, I think this is kind of the trick that all social movements have to go through and have to play with, which is you have to keep your eye on two things. You have to keep your eye on making people's lives better, because it's very needed. And you have to keep your eye on what kinds of fundamental change you would like to have. And you have to have that movement between those two things. So that's why, for example, you can still say this domestic violence law that was passed was necessary. It's good that it passed. While saying in the long term, this is what it excludes, this is what kinds of violences it reproduces. I feel similarly about a unified personal status law, that this is something we definitely need. It still ties sex to political difference, but it's going to make all of our lives a lot better. And it should just be incorporated into our legal system as family law, which is how it functions in the world, most of the world. Well, actually, one of the things I try to say is, I think we're really focused on the question of personal status, and we read into it the question of religion and sectarianism and religious pluralism. But if you think about it with feminist and queer theory, what these laws are family laws. This is a global form of law, and it's a global form of law that really is about reproduction, tied to a biological model of reproduction. Anti-sectarian activism. Yeah. I don't think that I wouldn't have framed the people that I worked with during that time as being the epitome of anti-sectarian activism. I think in some ways the project to produce an optional personal status law is not anti-sectarian. It's kind of accommodating, or I'm saying optional, not unified. And obviously, this coalition included and was inspired by things like queer pride, but also fell apart around the same sort of controversies. The question of political sectarianism, do you change it now or do you have to wait? The question of women's citizenship, and the question of gay rights and sexual rights more generally. We have dinner. I have a lot of things written.
Reply to Maya, Sara, Liz, Jamil. Sara, I feel it.
No, it's not a pressing thing. I'm hearing you speak and then reading the book, and then now hearing your response about the civil personal status, so unified civil person. You know, the tying and this idea you mentioned about this is not just a Lebanese problem. You know, the whole idea of tying sexual difference as political difference. No, it's abolishing we're talking about abolishing patriarchy essentially to get probably to that place, and to or the nation. They're tied. I mean, what comes first? So that's just the thing I wanted to say.
Okay, I suggest that we take a few questions from the floor. Please raise your hand. We'll send you a mic.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation and for the panel. I'm really interested in this question of imagining outside and past this world that's come up afterwards in the discussion. Can you, Professor Mikdashi, or any of the other panelists speak a little bit more about like what a world would look like outside of the sextarian system? I'm like having trouble conceiving it, and I'd be curious to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? This side? Yes, Kirsten.
I was wondering, Maya, if you could elaborate more on the epidermal state, and when you said you are discussing how does it feel, what does it feel like on a daily basis? If you could talk about the feelings, and also methodologically, perhaps, because this has become extremely important, how did you register those feelings?
I was wondering, Maya, if you might be able to elaborate a bit about, maybe it's a counterfactual question, but about the silences. What is the stuff that actually didn't make it into the archive, especially since, I mean, you're relying on court files, but I assume that a lot of lawsuits weren't taken up, they were thrown out of court, or they were kind of relegated or delegated to other social spheres where people, you know, should find a solution with outside of the courts, that, however, by the hegemonic of understanding of what issues can be addressed in court are actually part of the reification of the sectarian state that you describe, actually. And how could we get to these if we don't find them in these archives? Thanks.
Yes.
Anything to say about these questions, by the way?
Can I ask a question? I was very interested with that. I think it was a comment by Sara, and maybe you can come back to this in the discussion, all of you, or Maya in particular, about how the calls for a stronger state might be threatening, and it echoes what we heard earlier. I think it resonates in very interesting ways with the discipline we work in as urban planning, urban studies, urban design, where we're always asking for the state to be there, to be the custodian of the public good, of the common good. And that idea of like, the state can be also threatening to the public good, but maybe professionals, practitioners do not see it in the same way. So maybe a few reflections that you may have on for urban activists, environmental activists that keep asking for a stronger state, a more present state to protect the public good. How can we reimagine? And it goes back to that issue of reimagining another. I mean, who can be the custodian of the public good when we have a state that's a extractive predator, etc., etc.?
These are very small questions. Thank you. Just like one word answers. Yes, no. Good, bad.
We can't imagine.
Okay. So, imagining outside of a kind of political and how do you imagine yourselves outside of a sectarian system? I think you can think through that question at multiple scales. One of which would be something like radically changing the census system, the system of registration. But that would be one scale. Another scale is this sort of larger impossibility of what does political society look like? That is not grounded in reproduction, in sex. And I think it's important for us all to not always assume an answer to our question, because sometimes dwelling in the question is much more interesting than arriving at an answer. And that's kind of how I think about this. I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone has had an answer. This is feminist political theorists have been talking about this for like 70 years now. Nobody has an answer, but that doesn't mean that the question doesn't keep getting refined. And it doesn't mean that it's not important to still imagine, like you said, to insist on imagining a radical otherwise, even if at the back of your head you're like, oh my God, how would we do this? This is impossible, right? I think it's important for us politically and intellectually to have that exercise. So the silences of the archive. The good thing about working in a state institution, other than it being burned, or actually, like, I went to get another file just last week, and they told me, oh, this archive was thrown out when they moved it from Concord to Adliye. Because during the war, this particular court was meeting at Concord up here. But the good thing when working in state archives is that they are actually good record keepers. So what gets heard by the plenary assembly is set by law, right? So there's a procedure, like any court in the world. This court has this particular, there are these particular things that any case has to satisfy in order to be heard at this assembly. However, everything that gets advanced to the assembly creates a record, even if it's not heard, right? So the file itself is still in the archive. It'll just say at the end, this is not our, we can't hear this, right? So it's actually, the silence is very active, and the silence is actually findable in some ways, and you can trace the contours of these silences through what judges and the plenary assembly decides decides not to hear. Especially since, and this is we have a very conservative judiciary in addition to many other things, but it's very conservative in how it practices its rights. And actually this is something that has changed from pre-war to post-war. In the pre-war period, there were judges and certain judicial bodies that were much more, I would say, challenging and desiring to practice more of their power. And not even like after 1997 or 8, it's become a quite conservative interpretation of what the basically adliya, the court system has the right to do vis-a-vis personal status courts and vis-a-vis all kinds of courts. And you can see this, for example, in the port explosion. If these judges wanted to exercise their whole rights, they would actually throw out all the challenges that are coming to the investigation, saying this is like obstruction of justice. They have that right, they just don't practice it, okay? And here it actually really matters who judges are, what their legal history is, what their legal personalities are, and I think we should all be heavily invested in how judges get appointed and who these judges are, because sometimes they actually have hearings, you know, and it would be good to actually be at those hearings before they're appointed. The epidermal state. I have to say this was a really, this and the archive chapter were just really hard to write because it was very, it was just very difficult to write. In the archive chapter, I think it's more obvious because I say at the end, like, I don't know. It could be all these things, but I'm not going to give you an answer because the answer I give you now could be a different answer in 10 years. And that's the point of archival openness. But with the epidermal state, basically, I was working with a divorce case. And it was really a case about domestic violence that hinged on the result of a hymen exam. And this hymen exam was done under violent circumstances, coercive circumstances, after a pattern and before a pattern of continued violence, physical and sexual violence within a marriage. And when you work with court files, they can be anywhere from like this thin to this big, and they include all the evidence ever advanced to a court. They include things like court transcripts, the briefs that lawyers file, the minutes of, let's say, a security officer, a testimony from a doctor. They include, and then all the different courts that you have to go through in order to get to this high court, right? Because you have to, it doesn't hear, it's a final court. So it has to go through different legal steps before it reaches this court. So it was very difficult material, let's say, to work with. My mother helped me with it, actually. And I think I'm always very grateful for her for helping me see something that I hadn't seen. And the difficulty of working with it in some ways was made easier for me as a researcher to think about it more broadly in conversation with anal exams, because this is something that I had come across as just an activist and as working within particular social rights movements. Because I was really wanted to make the point that if the state is felt as violent, it is a violent state, and it's very jealous over its where it chooses to exert violence. And when it exerts violence in ways that are highly embodied and are highly about producing the stakes of different bodies, whether it's about legal status, race, sex, gender, and sexuality itself. So both of these tests, hymen exams and anal exams, test for, in some ways, the same thing. Bodies doing things that they shouldn't be doing, right? And through the test, they actually produce what kind of body it is. So if you are a woman who is trans, the test that they will perform on you is also saying, no, you are a man, right? It's one way of fixing the body. And the sort of how I trace that experience of the state was also things that are not in the chapter, which include just talking with people who have been subject to these kinds of tests, both people of all genders and all sexualities, and ethnography of, and this is where I think it gets tricky, because these are people, you know, these, in many cases, these are friends. A friend of mine was actually detained at a makhfar and tested and threatened and very violently treated, let's say, around the question of anal and hymen exams. So, yeah, I think in order to sketch it out, I tried to do both an archival and an ethnographic approach, but I also needed to have great sensitivity because people are talking about things that are really awful. And sometimes actually the ethnographic sensitivity is to not do something. So for example, I could find these people who are in the court cases. It's not hard. We don't have a public secrets law. So all the documents are unredacted, okay? So when you see a file that's from the late 2000s that revolves around a hymen exam and it's a horrible story of violence, it's very easy to reach this person and say, كيف حسيتي? Like you're Maya Mikdashi or something. But sometimes the actual sensitive thing is to say, no, I'm not gonna try to reach this person. I don't wanna talk to her. I don't want to reproduce this for her. And I don't wanna take on that position where I have the right to just call her and ask her about these kinds of questions. So it's a weird navigation. Was that it? Oh, the public good. Actually, I think you guys talk about this a lot. You know what the public, like, what to do with the state. You know, you need it, but it's awful. But you need, you know, we need to have it, but oh my God, once you have it, you need to resist it immediately, right? And I think that's okay to embrace contradiction.
I think, yeah, no, I'd like to just speak more of that. Because I think planners tend to say we need the state and stop, rather than continuing and saying, no, it's awful. I think it's more social scientists that may do that. And
maybe it's just my conversations with Ahmad. I'm like, you're all like this. You're all like this about the state.
I mean, sometimes professionals and practitioners cannot say that. They're sitting in the same room with public agents.
Right.
And, you know, they need to converse with them. And they need to tell them, we want to work with you. And so they cannot tell
get
you.
rid of you. Yeah.
And they cannot tell them, you're awful. I cannot work with you. I mean, or
No,
they are not planners. They become perhaps a bit like me, commenting on planning rather than doing planning. So I think I'm trying to ask more from the perspective of people needing to do planning or policy. I mean, it would work with any social policy, economic policy, health policy.
In my experience working with a lot of government employees at some very high levels of the judiciary, there's nobody who's more skeptical of the state than the people who work in it. They actually know in many ways what the pitfalls of any kind of state are. They know the problems of the state. They're the ones who are actually dealing with the taped up state that we have. They're the people doing the taping, you know, to make sure that at least some modicum of daily life happens. Like when I was at Adliya last week, there was a bunch of people registering marriages, getting just the proper, you know, paperwork of marriages. Somebody has to go there just to make sure that these things still function. And those people know very well what the problems of the state are. Yeah, I think the question of the public good has to, in some ways, be wrested from the state and just back to the public. The state should not be, especially if you think about how the state actually interprets what the public good is legally, and how it's linked to two other concepts, public morality and public order. And in that project, I would say that sometimes when you approach people and you don't assume that they have a visceral identification with the state project, right? Like, oh, you work in Mabarif, like Baladiyat Beirut, so you really believe in the state, that you really, and it's like, no, this guy needs a job, it's good public benefits, he knows what the problems are, and sometimes that can become a conversation that is very creative, let's say, because they know what the problems are. I don't think they've, at least in the people that I've worked with, nobody views themselves as a rescuer or as really embodying like the ethos of the state. Maybe there was like one guy who really was like, ana al-qada, you know, like this is what it is. But he was like very high level, and you can see him any time on TV now and embodying the same kind of ethos. But even he, when you're like, come on, man, he's like, yeah, I know. You know? So it's all a performance. Everyone is performing. We don't have to assume the viscerality of each performance, I would say. Mabari. You have a question? You have the mic?
Privilege. I think I'm gonna follow up on Muna's question about the state and on Sara's about the most radical form of change being instituting a civil personal law, personal status law, and ask Maya, from your experience, really, institutionally, where do we start? Is there within the state avenues of hope? I mean, really. What is it? Should we now pass a law? Do we have champions that can help? It's just picking your brain on the Lebanese context. Thank you.
When I realized that the archive of the highest court had been burnt in a fire, in a war, I started to think about like the radical political possibilities of fire. And so, especially in a location where maybe things are not fully digitized. Yeah. So about 20 years ago, I was trying desperately to be like, let's burn Nufus. Let's just burn it. Because once you burn it, there's actually no replacement. And many different, you know. And the response to that is often you see everyone's investment in certain kinds of reproduction, right? Like, oh, what will happen to property? What will happen to the, what will happen to sigile, like every, you know. But to me, that's a like really, I became very interested in this question of how can we imagine actually destroying and really creating some kind of political chaos out of which a motive would. And to me, that's not about adding laws. It's about doing things like this, that really take an antagonistic posture towards the system that includes laws and bureaucracies. Now we've kind of lost our chance because a lot of it is digitized. Really, we lost, not all of it.
No, I mean hacking.
Hacking, masalan, and other forms, new technologies create new possibilities. But
no exams for a sect, unfortunately.
But I think that here really like, when you ask this, like, what would it mean to burn it? You actually see all the data the state has, and our investment in the state having that kind of data and reproducing that kind of data. How will the state know who my children are? I mean, it's one thing, right? How will they know what I inherited and what I hope to leave? How will they know where I vote, where I'm from? How will they know my age? How will they know if this person has a court case against him? So it's recorded on the. Every time when you say burn it down, get rid of it, hack it, and someone goes, "Ugh," that's the state. That's how the reproduction of the state.
How, as social scientists, for example, we conduct a study, who we want to hear on the other side of that. It seems you're describing a non-representational project. You're not saying that this is necessarily a representation. And coming to Jamil's point about, did you select 100 cases and were you true to the flavor of all those cases? I think you're saying, as you did say, knowledge production or articulation requires taking your position and not trying to impose it on everyone else through a kind of selected representationality, but rather using that spot to think how much you can imagine and how much you're not allowed to imagine according to which infrastructures. And so I think that makes all of us have to think about how we conduct research. And a lot of our research in Lebanon has been trying to speak back to the state, even when we say it doesn't exist. Learning to speak state speak. And maybe that's not even the audience. Maybe, as you're suggesting now, is the cringe at, oh my God, my children wouldn't be recognized by the state, is something that people need to work on. And yeah, I would love to talk to you more about feelings, but.
Hi, thank you. As you were talking now, and you mentioned what happens to property and inheritance, it reminded me that I think one of the main points about this census regime, and in conjunction with the personal status laws, is its reproduction of class, right? And thinking about how class figures in this entire matrix of sectarianism is something that I wish that you had explored a bit more in the book. Especially also thinking about sects as material constituencies as well, whether through like religious institutions that have lots of assets, or as political, economic makeups, with the Zaim at its head. So just, I would like to hear what you have to say about how class figures into sectarianism. Thank you.
Just to follow up on the conversation, I wanted to ask, what comes first, society and societal values, or law? And where should we start? If we do burn everything and the people still think the same way, we're just going to regenerate the same system. So just something I wanted to ask. Thank you.
I suggest concluding. So you wanna
maybe this point on how do we do research and who do we talk to. My question was not assume. This idea that you acknowledge that yes, there are gatekeepers, so they become gatekeepers and to a certain extent knowledge producers, and they construct, imagine I'm going to Al-Mahkam al-Jafari, for instance, and the guy or the woman there only wants me to see very specific cases whereby it's in his or her interest to re-infer, etc., to validate his point, basically, or sectarian positionality or whatever. Is this what we should always do, or there are other ways to navigate and find alternative, entry point into this very bureaucratic system and very politicized system, as you clearly say? So this is a question that maybe we should push the analysis a bit forward, at least to find some answers as to how do we go about it. My second point on the state, since I somehow work, Again, I'm not calling, when we do research, this mapping, I'm not saying, we should go qualitative research, but at least to see how do we, find different cases, maybe thematic. I go to the mahkamah and say, I want all cases related to X topic, and then I figure it out. Maybe, I don't know, I'm just, when it comes to the state, practitioner, politicians, policymakers, scholars, whether we get rid of this category called state or not, I think we should, as a first stage, move beyond this dichotomy between weak and strong state. We should not qualify the state, because Maya shows us clearly that at some point, the suffering and violence that was felt individually was felt collectively later on in 2019, and finally some Lebanese realized, there is a state and it's violent. So I feel that we should move beyond this categorization and maybe claim the concept of, the state as a source of justice, instead of saying we want a strong state, we want a fair state, a source of justice for everyone. So this is something that I've been thinking about in my work. What does justice mean? I don't know. But I mean, we should definitely, I believe it's very helpful to go beyond the categorization of weak state, failed, I don't know what, strong,
Am I supposed to say something?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Last comments, if you'd like, or
okay. Bureaucracy. We can take this on later, but I still think that there's something important in terms of thinking about sectarianism as a form of bureaucratic violence and what that means. The literature in anthropology, in the anthropology of bureaucracy, is about imagination, but it's also about its relationship to interpretation, and the ways in which part of what happens with bureaucracy is that it kills the imagination, precisely because increasingly you're limited to interpret things. So there is increasingly limited space to do imaginative identification, to imagine somebody else and how they might live their life. So in a sense, I still think that there is something, I think there's something very important that your book contributes to the discussions in the anthropology of bureaucracy, and most especially in terms of thinking about what would happen to your analysis, your future analysis, that is, if you thought about, in more specific terms, sectarianism as bureaucratic violence.
So maybe I just wanted to, maybe I'm just adding one more thing on the table, building on sectarianism as a form of bureaucratic violence, and building on your comment about what do we do if we change everything but the people just reproduce the same shit, or Jumana's point about the vested interests in sectarianism in terms of the accumulation of capital and property relations. And here is where, and this is something maybe I didn't ask before, it's just thinking about sectarianism not just as a modality of state power, and the state as not the only entity that has a vested interest in reproducing. So thinking and taking this time issue, like the time difference today, as a technology of sectarianization, right? We see it from above, but then you see what's happening from below, which is, there is a strong sectarian sentiment. So it's not all just the fiction of the state manifesting. There's something else from below happening. Yeah.
I agree entirely. I mean, I don't think it's just the state. I think there's an ideological discourse and a political discourse that circulates through the state, but in fact circulates through the relationship in some ways between the state and society and political discourse, and how very easily questions of sectarianism and sectarian discourse veer into sex very often over things like citizenship, right? Over things like, oh, what about our way of life? And actually what they're referring to very much has to do with sex and gender. So yeah, I do think that it operates discursively, practically, all those different ways. I guess I would say, like, if you burn it, what will come after? Will they just reproduce it? I would like to see them try. Because I think a lot of the power of the system comes from a misattribution to history, and a misattribution to something produced as authentic socially, as a patriarchal form of power, when in fact it's French. I mean, it's French patriarchy. That's actually what's happening. In terms of in terms of just that area of the state. So I think definitely law and society are in a relationship, but the question is, where do you put your foot down on the different scales of that relationship? So something that people, and this is, I talk about this in the book a little bit, something that people always talk about with political sectarianism, it is like the chicken or the egg. Do you abolish it? What if you abolish it and people are still sectarian? Then what do you do? Or do you have to wait till people are no longer sectarian before you abolish it, right? I come down on the side of abolish it. In, like, this kind of pedagogical approach, right? Like, you must change society in order to have political change, actually means it sets up a kind of relationship that is hierarchical, but also ends up projecting the time of the state forever in the future. Because you can always perfect it. You can always change society better, 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 and you have to wait, right? And this is something that people have thought about in very different contexts, just about liberalism, how it kind of produces this particular temporality of political change that is rooted in, quote, hearts and minds, right? Then you get to change the political system. I put my foot on the scale of just changing it. But we can have that debate, I guess. Property relations, absolutely. I do think that there is a economic, financial property system here that is at play. One of my frustrations, actually, is that political economists don't talk about inheritance law. And it's absurd, because if you're, you know, like, try to do like an analysis of wealth without inheritance, Marx will be like rolling in his grave, right? Like, it's not gonna happen. But I think sometimes we have such strong epistemological boundaries that you actually don't see what's right in front of you. So sectarianism is one of those things that is so strong that something so obvious in front of you, which is how sect is actually reproduced through kinship and through this kind of biological reproduction, you just don't see it. It's unseen. I think in some ways the property interests of sectarian institutions is one of those things that they try not to unsee, or they try to make you unsee. But now you see, of course, what's happening at the port with who's the person who's smuggling in. What are all the different bodies that are smuggling in things and not paying taxes? A big one is Dar al-Fatwa. It's a big institution that's doing this. Who is not paying taxes? The Maronite Church is not paying taxes, right? Neither is. Who is, it's true. I mean, this is a rumor, so I shouldn't repeat it, but I will by saying it's a rumor, that these institutions all have also money locked in the banks. And who knows if some has actually gone back? And who knows what was taken outside from these institutions? So there's definitely an economic architecture here. And actually, there's going to be a book talk in a few weeks also by my colleague Nada Momtaz. You should come. If it's also Beirut Lab, will be hosting it. And she specifically works on waqf. What is an awqaf? The system of property and how it is financialized in some ways historically. And in my own work, you can see this when it comes to religious conversion sometimes, because you have cases where, let's say I die tomorrow and I don't have children, or I have no, and I had converted. Well, I'm not a good example. Let me think. There is actually a case that I worked on where there's this man whose uncle converted to Islam, okay, a long time ago. And because he was a convert to Islam, he had nobody to inherit his wealth. In that context, who inherits the wealth? The waqf, actually, of his, no, the waqf. He had because he was a different religion, right? So the waqf inherits it. So his nephew the guy gets sick and he's dying, and his nephew is like, I'm also gonna convert now, okay? And he converts, and legally he becomes the only legal heir. Well, who fights his conversion? And these religious institutions never fight conversions, okay? The Waqf sues him, okay? So there are clearly, property is something that animates all of this, as does class. I will say, I try to make clear that in order to get to this court, you need resources. Like any court in the world that's a Supreme Court or a High Court, it takes years actually to be heard at that level of the state. And it means it means resources. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Maya. Round of applause for everyone.
I wanted to just add something, sorry.
Yes,
because I forgot here. It's, so this is how I was doing my work in these archives. I was telling people, like, what do you think is important? But you're also looking at the records. Every single, there's an index of all the records, and you choose what you want. So nobody is, and that's actually the difference between religious courts and the state court. Because I was having a really hard time going into Christian courts asking for material because they were like, oh, you're not Christian. I don't know about this. Let me show you what I think, okay? And then I had the opposite problem in the Muslim courts. They were like, oh, ya binti, come, let me show you. And the one of the ways I got out of this was actually looking at state courts, because it's just the ledger. And then you say, I want this one, this one, this one, this one, that one, and it gets retrieved. Which is what I did.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think you gave us a lot of questions to dwell on. I'll keep on remembering that. I think we're at times where we need to do this. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Look up for further book talks. We'll keep you posted. And thanks, Ahmad, for organizing. Thanks, Isabella, Antonia, Beirut Urban Lab people who are here and listening to us online as well. And have a good evening.